Dawn broke hesitantly over the Philippine jungle on January 12, 1942. The air hung thick with humidity and the distant thunder of Japanese artillery. At the hastily assembled field hospital near Bataan, Lieutenant Margaret Davison wiped sweat from her brow as she assessed supplies in the medical tent. The wooden crates of bandages were nearly empty, the morphine supply critically low, and the quinine, essential for treating the malaria that ravaged troops faster than enemy bullets, was down to the last few precious bottles. 29 years old and 3 months into her deployment with the Army Nurse Corps, Margaret had already witnessed more death than in her entire 7-year nursing career at Boston General. Her crisp white uniform had long since been replaced by mud-stained khaki, her carefully pinned hair now hastily tucked under a worn cap. The stethoscope around her neck felt heavier with each passing day. "Lieutenant, 3 more malaria cases from the 31st Infantry," called Corporal Jenkins as stretcher-bearers carried in soldiers whose skin had turned a sickly yellow, their bodies convulsing with fever. Margaret nodded grimly. "Put them with the others in Ward C," she instructed, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. The makeshift ward, nothing more than a cleared section of jungle floor covered with tarp, already held 37 men battling the disease. Without sufficient medication, half would be dead within days. She turned back to the supply inventory, pencil hovering above paper. The medical reality was simple and brutal. Supplies designed for a 3-week engagement had to stretch indefinitely. The promised relief shipments had never arrived. The Japanese forces had cut them off entirely, and evacuation seemed increasingly unlikely. They were on their own. As mortar fire intensified in the distance, Margaret made a decision. She closed her inventory book with quiet determination and walked toward the makeshift pharmacy at the rear of the field hospital. It was time to attempt what the military medical manual explicitly forbade: to create something new from the dwindling resources they had left. The medical crisis on Bataan had been months in the making. When Japanese forces launched their offensive across the Pacific in December 1941, American and Filipino troops retreated to the peninsula as part of a desperate defensive strategy. The medical units followed, evacuating patients from Manila's hospitals to open-air field facilities in the jungle. Lieutenant Margaret Davison arrived with the 2nd Field Hospital Unit, bringing her specialized training in tropical medicine from Johns Hopkins. What she hadn't anticipated was the scale of the disaster they would face. The military planners had severely underestimated both the Japanese advance and the threat of disease in the tropical environment. "We've lost 17 men to malaria since Tuesday," Captain Robert Thornton, the chief medical officer, informed his staff during the morning briefing. The hospital's tin roof amplified the sound of tropical rain beating down around them. The 31st Infantry reports 30% of their fighting force is now incapacitated, and we have exactly 2,340 quinine tablets remaining. Margaret did the mental calculation. At standard dosages, 10 grains per patient per day, they had enough to treat only a fraction of the current cases for less than a week. After that, the mortality rate would skyrocket. "What about the supply drops?" asked Lieutenant Williams, a young pharmacist from Denver. Captain Thornton shook his head. "All flights cancelled. The Japanese control the airspace now." The technical problem wasn't just a shortage of quinine. The standard military protocol required pure quinine sulfate administered in specific dosages. Deviating from this protocol was a court-martial offense. Medical experimentation in combat conditions wasn't just discouraged, it was expressly forbidden by military regulation 11-457, which Margaret had memorized during her training. But as she walked through Ward C later that day, watching soldiers writhe with the telltale fevers, something inside her hardened into resolve. The men called out for water, for relief, for their mothers. Private Lewis Miller, just 19, grabbed her hand as she checked his temperature. 106.2 degrees. "Am I going to die, ma'am?" he whispered through cracked lips. Margaret squeezed his hand, feeling the burning heat of his skin. "Not if I have anything to say about it, Private." That evening, she approached Captain Thornton with a proposal so unorthodox it could end her military career, if they survived long enough for that to matter. The improvised laboratory consisted of a folding table, a small alcohol burner, and an assortment of beakers and tubes Margaret had salvaged from the hospital's damaged equipment. Working by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, she carefully measured powders and liquids into precise proportions. Her idea had come from an unlikely source, a conversation with a Filipino nurse's aide named Eleanor, whose grandmother had been a traditional healer in a mountain village. When the Spanish controlled the islands, Elena had told her, quinine was so valuable it was worth more than gold. The locals learned to extend it by combining it with other plants that enhanced its effect. Margaret had studied tropical medicine extensively, but this was knowledge no Western medical school taught. Elena had shown her a bitter bark called dita from the Alstonia scalaris tree, known locally for its fever-reducing properties. There was also the macabuhay vine, which indigenous healers used to treat malaria when cinchona bark, the source of quinine, wasn't available. The science was speculative at best. Margaret knew that combining these traditional elements with their pharmaceutical supplies might amplify the quinine's effectiveness, or it might create something useless, or worse, toxic. She was operating on the very edge of her medical knowledge, guided partly by science and partly by desperate necessity. "What exactly are you doing, Lieutenant?" The voice startled her. Captain Thornton stood in the doorway, his face half hidden in shadow. Margaret straightened her back but continued working. "I'm creating an extended-release quinine compound, sir. By binding the active alkaloids with local botanical elements, I believe we can reduce the required dosage by half, possibly more. You're aware this violates at least 3 sections of medical protocol." His voice was measured, neither approving nor condemning. "I am, sir." Her hands remained steady as she continued measuring. "I'm also aware that in approximately 5 days, we'll have no treatment options whatsoever for the 47 current malaria patients, not to mention new cases." The captain stepped closer, examining her work. "Have you tested this?" "On blood samples from 3 patients. The parasite response is promising. I need authorization for a human trial." Captain Thornton was silent for a long moment, the distant sounds of artillery punctuating the heavy air between them. Finally, he spoke. "If this goes wrong, Lieutenant, I'll take full responsibility, sir." Margaret met his eyes directly. He nodded slowly. "Start with 5 patients, the most severe cases. Document everything meticulously." As he turned to leave, he added quietly, "Margaret, if this works, well, let's just hope it works." Through the night, Margaret refined her formula. The process was painstaking, crushing the local botanicals to extract their essence, combining them with the precious quinine in a solution that would be both stable and absorbable. Each step required absolute precision. A small error could render an entire batch ineffective. A larger error could kill. By morning, she had produced enough of her compound for the first trial. She labeled the bottles with a simple designation, Compound M. The M stood for mixture, though some would later say it stood for miracle or for Margaret. The trial began with 5 patients, as Captain Thornton had authorized. Margaret selected men whose conditions were critical but not yet hopeless, men who would likely die without intervention but still had enough strength to possibly respond to treatment. Private Lewis Miller was among them. At 19, he had the resilience of youth, but 3 days of high fever had left him severely dehydrated and delirious. Next to him lay Sergeant Frank Delaney, a veteran of the First World War, whose weathered face now shone with malarial sweats. The other 3 were similar cases, all failing rapidly, all with the telltale blood test showing high concentrations of the Plasmodium parasite. "This is an experimental treatment," Margaret explained to each patient, or, when they were too delirious, to the medic assisting her. "Standard dosing, 4 times daily, careful monitoring." The compound was a murky brown liquid with a bitter, complex taste. Margaret administered the first doses herself, recording the exact time, dosage, and initial reactions. Then began the waiting, the hardest part of any medical intervention. At hour 6, Sergeant Delaney's fever dropped 1 degree. At hour 12, Private Miller's parasitic count showed a marginal decrease. Small changes, but in the right direction. Margaret continued the treatment while maintaining detailed records of every observation. By the morning of the second day, the results were becoming clear. 4 of the 5 patients showed significant improvement. Their fevers had reduced, parasitic loads were decreasing, and cognitive function was returning. Only 1 patient, Corporal Henry Wilson, showed minimal response, though his condition hadn't worsened. "I need to adjust the formula," Margaret told Elena as they prepared the next batch of medication. "The acidity level needs to be higher for the alkaloids to fully bind." Word of the experimental treatment spread quickly through the hospital. By the 3rd day, Captain Thornton authorized expanding the trial to 15 more patients. The results continued to be promising, not a miracle cure, but a viable treatment that extended their limited quinine supply. Then came the complication. Colonel James Prescott, the senior medical officer for the region, arrived on an inspection tour. A stern traditionalist with 30 years in military medicine, he immediately questioned the unorthodox treatment. "You've authorized an untested compound to be administered to American soldiers," he demanded of Captain Thornton, his voice carrying across the hospital compound. "It's showing results, sir," Thornton replied evenly. "Lieutenant Davison has documented a 72% reduction in mortality among treated cases. Lieutenant Davison has violated basic medical protocol and endangered patients under her care," Colonel Prescott countered. "This stops immediately. Return to standard treatment regimens." The confrontation culminated in Margaret being summoned to explain herself. She brought her case notes, samples of the compound, and 2 recovered patients who volunteered to testify to its effectiveness. "Colonel, with all due respect," she stated, standing ramrod straight before his makeshift desk, "we have 312 malaria cases and quinine sufficient for perhaps 40 patients at standard dosages. My compound treats effectively at 1/4 the quinine requirement per patient." Colonel Prescott studied her notes in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he looked up. "This compound hasn't been approved by any medical authority." "No, sir," Margaret acknowledged, "but neither has death from untreated malaria." The standoff might have ended in Margaret's removal, except for the events of the next morning. A Japanese bombing run targeted their position, scoring a direct hit on the medical supply depot. What remained of their pharmaceutical stores went up in flames, including the last pure quinine supplies. Colonel Prescott found Margaret treating blast injuries, her uniform stained with blood and soot. "Lieutenant," he said quietly, "I believe we'll need as much of your compound as you can produce. Immediately." In the weeks that followed, Margaret's field laboratory expanded to a production facility staffed by 6 nurses and 4 pharmacists. They gathered local botanicals, processed them according to her formulation, and combined them with the remaining quinine they could salvage or obtain through guerrilla supply lines. Compound M became the standard treatment for malaria throughout Bataan and later Corregidor. It wasn't perfect. Some patients still died, and the side effects were sometimes severe, but hundreds who would have perished without any treatment recovered sufficiently to return to duty. By April 1942, as American and Filipino forces faced the final Japanese assault on Bataan, over 60% of the fighting force had received treatment with Compound M. Military historians would later note that without this improvised medication, the defense of Bataan might have collapsed weeks earlier from disease alone. The fall of Bataan on April 9, 1942, and Corregidor a month later, resulted in the capture of most American medical personnel. Lieutenant Margaret Davison was among those taken prisoner and interned at Santo Tomas University in Manila, converted by the Japanese into a civilian internment camp. Even in captivity, her work continued. When Japanese officers ordered Navy nurse Laura Cobb to catalogue the medical supplies at the camp, Margaret and other nurses deliberately mislabeled their remaining stocks of Compound M as bicarbonate of soda and other innocuous substances. When the Japanese confiscated what they recognized as valuable medications, they overlooked these mislabeled bottles, allowing the nurses to maintain a covert treatment program for prisoners suffering from malaria and other tropical diseases. For 3 years, the nurses of Santo Tomas operated a secret medical practice within the camp. Margaret trained others to prepare her compound, using whatever ingredients they could obtain through sympathetic Filipino contacts or grow in hidden gardens within the camp compound. The Japanese never discovered the true nature of their activities. When American forces finally liberated Manila in February 1945, Margaret and her fellow nurses were found emaciated, but still working to treat the sick. Army medical officers were astonished by the survival rate in the camp, particularly for diseases that typically proved fatal in prolonged captivity. Margaret's medical logs, meticulously maintained throughout her captivity, became the basis for a post-war study on anti-malarial treatments in resource-constrained environments. The U.S. Army Medical Research Institute formally analyzed Compound M in 1946, confirming its efficacy and identifying the specific interactions between the quinine alkaloids and the local botanical elements that enhanced its effectiveness. The official report stated, Lieutenant Davison's formulation represents a significant advancement in anti-malarial treatment under combat conditions. What began as a violation of protocol born of necessity ultimately saved an estimated 1,200 lives during the Bataan and Corregidor campaigns, with additional uncounted survivors in internment facilities. Margaret Davison received the Distinguished Service Cross for her actions, one of only a handful of women so honored during World War II. More importantly to her, the Army Medical Corps revised its field protocols to include specific provisions for medical innovation under extreme circumstances, what became known informally as the Davison Directive. After the war, she continued her career in tropical medicine, establishing a research facility in the Philippines that specialized in combining traditional healing knowledge with modern pharmaceutical approaches. The facility operated until her death in 1978. Today, a small plaque at the former site of the Bataan Field Hospital commemorates her work. It reads simply, "On this ground in 1942, necessity became the mother of invention and courage the father of innovation. Lieutenant Margaret Davison, Army Nurse Corps. Her unauthorized medicine saved hundreds." Military archivists still maintain the original formula for Compound M in their records, now declassified but preserved as a testament to human ingenuity in the face of impossible circumstances, and to one nurse who risked everything to save lives when conventional medicine could not. The tropical rain fell in sheets across the campus of Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda Church, Maryland. It was October 2023, nearly 8 decades after the fall of Bataan, and Dr. Elaine Winters stared at the aged leather journal in front of her with growing amazement. "This can't be right," she murmured, reaching for her tablet to cross-reference the chemical compounds listed in the spidery handwriting. As the head of Walter Reed's Tropical Disease Research Division, Elaine had reviewed thousands of historical medical documents, but nothing like Lieutenant Margaret Davison's field notes from 1942. The journal had been discovered during the digitization of World War II medical archives, tucked away in a box of miscellaneous reports from the Pacific Theatre. Most of the box contained routine supply requisitions and casualty reports, but Margaret's journal, her actual working notes, not the sanitized official version, detailed something extraordinary. Dr. Winters, her assistant, Captain James Chen, knocked lightly on the office door. "You asked me to remind you about the conference call with the WHO team in Thailand." Elaine nodded absently, her eyes still fixed on the journal. "James, look at this," she said, motioning him over. "This army nurse in the Philippines combined quinine with local botanicals, Alstonia scolaris bark and Tinospora crispivine, and created a compound that was 4 times more effective than standard quinine against malaria." Captain Chen leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. "That's impossible. The pharmacokinetics wouldn't work." "Except according to these patient records, it did work." Elaine flipped the page, revealing meticulously recorded treatment outcomes. "And look at her molecular theory. She hypothesized that certain alkaloids in the local plants acted as transport mechanisms for the quinine, enhancing cellular uptake." That's remarkably advanced thinking for 1942, especially for a field nurse working in a jungle with no laboratory equipment. Elaine carefully closed the journal. "And it might be exactly what we need for our current problem." The current problem was a newly resistant strain of malaria that had emerged in Southeast Asia, immune to standard treatments and spreading rapidly. The Walter Reed team had been working with international partners for months, trying to develop an effective countermeasure before the strain could reach epidemic proportions. 3 weeks later, in a secure laboratory at Walter Reed, Elaine and her team had recreated Compound M, according to Margaret Davison's formula, using botanical samples obtained from the Philippines. Initial tests against the resistant malaria strain showed promising results, not a complete cure, but significantly better than any existing treatment. "It's the molecular binding mechanism," explained Dr. Sanvi Patel, the team's pharmaceutical chemist. "Lieutenant Davison intuitively discovered something we've only recently begun to understand with modern equipment. The dita bark contains alkaloids that essentially disguise the quinine molecule, allowing it to bypass the parasite's resistance mechanisms." As their research progressed, Elaine arranged a visit to the Philippines to trace Margaret's footsteps. In a small village near the former Bataan Peninsula, she met Elena Reyes, the 97-year-old granddaughter of the Elena who had first shared traditional healing knowledge with Lieutenant Davison. "My grandmother said that American nurse had the heart of a healer and the mind of a scientist," the elderly woman told Elaine, sitting in the shade of her modest home. "They worked together even in the prison camp, passing knowledge back and forth. The Japanese never knew." Elena showed Elaine her grandmother's own journal, written in Tagalog with botanical drawings that matched those in Margaret's notes. She always said the best medicine comes when different healing traditions respect each other, not one replacing the other, but combining strengths. By early 2024, the Walter Reed team had developed a refined version of Compound M that effectively treated the resistant malaria strain. The WHO authorized emergency deployment in Thailand, Myanmar, and Cambodia, where the new strain had claimed thousands of lives. 6 months later, at a medical conference in Geneva, Elaine presented their findings to the international community. On the screen behind her was a photograph of Lieutenant Margaret Davison, standing tall in her Army Nurse Corps uniform before she shipped out to the Philippines. "Sometimes the past holds solutions for the future," Elaine concluded. Lieutenant Davison's work reminds us that innovation often happens at the intersection of different knowledge systems, especially under the pressure of necessity. Her illegal medicine, created in defiance of regulations but in service of saving lives, has now come full circle to save lives again. The pharmaceutical version of Compound M was officially named Davisonin, the first modern medication to acknowledge its origins in both military field medicine and indigenous healing traditions. The patent was structured as an open-source formula, ensuring affordable access for developing nations where malaria remained endemic. In a quiet ceremony held on National Nurses Day 2025, a bronze plaque was added to the Nurses Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery. It depicted Lieutenant Margaret Davison working in her makeshift laboratory on Bataan, with words she had written in her journal during those desperate days. When conventional wisdom fails, we must look beyond our training to the wisdom of others. Medicine is not merely science, it is a bridge between knowledge systems, built by those willing to listen across boundaries. Today we improvised. Tomorrow, perhaps, this improvisation will become standard care. As part of the ceremony, several elderly Filipino-American veterans stood in attendance. The last survivors of Bataan, whose lives had been saved by an army nurse who dared to break the rules. Their presence was living testimony to Margaret Davison's legacy, a legacy that now extended into the modern era, saving lives across continents through the rediscovery of her wartime innovation. The official military record now acknowledged what those who survived Bataan had always known, that in the darkest moments of war, it was not just courage under fire that saved lives, but courage in defying convention when conventional methods failed. Lieutenant Margaret Davison's story had become more than historical footnote. It was now a blueprint for medical innovation in crisis, taught to every military medical officer and field nurse in training. In the archives of the Army Medical Corps, her journal remained preserved as a reminder that sometimes the most essential medical advances come not from state-of-the-art laboratories, but from the desperate ingenuity of those on the front lines, armed with knowledge, compassion, and the willingness to attempt the seemingly impossible when lives hang in the balance.